Okay, as we start this 335i project off, there's a few things that we need to get right on the car before we can start adding more power and adding more performance to this car. One of the first things, and I know this because the brake pad sensor has gone off and alerted me to this, is that we need to replace the front brake pads on the car. We also need to do a brake bleeding or a flushing of the brake fluid system because that's also overdue. In order to flush the brake fluid through the system, we're going to need a few things. We're going to need a few tools. Now, yes, I know you can do this by yourself if you have some ingenuity, a block of wood to wedge under the brake pedal or what have you. But this is going to be the right way to do it by yourself. It's going to save you a lot of time. It's going to make it a lot easier. So the first thing obviously is going to be the brake fluid itself. Theoretically you only need about 1/2 liter of fluid for a full flush on this car, but I got 2 just in case. It's better to have too much than not enough, obviously. Now this particular fluid is going to give us a slight performance increase as well, not in braking power necessarily, but in longevity, as if we were to do several really hard braking situations back to back, then this fluid would have a much higher boiling temperature than the stock fluid. Now we have a catch can. This is going to hook up to the bleeder valve and catch the old fluid. And then we have a power bleeder. This one will connect to the brake booster and will push the new fluid into the system through pressure, so that you don't have to get a buddy to help you and pump the brake pedal, or you don't have to rig up some ghetto fabulous way to do this. I'm going to be going over the bleeding of the system later after the pad replacement, so if you're interested only in that, go ahead and fast forward to later on in the video. In order to change the front brake pads, these are the tools that we're going to need, other than the obvious sockets and so forth. The first thing would be the pads themselves. These are Hawk HPS pads, so these are going to be a high performance street version. They're going to be a little bit better than stock as far as performance goes, so they're going to cost a little bit more, but hopefully they'll be worth it. So they come with a new sensor, which actually 2, but you only need 1 because in order to get the maintenance light to turn off and to you're going to need to replace the sensor with it. Now a lot of times you're going to have to buy these separately for 20 bucks, but these actually came with it and I was pleasantly surprised. You're also going to need this. You're going to need some sort of compound to put on the back of not the calipers, but the pads themselves. You're going to need some grease to put on the calipers. Any parts, metal parts that move against each other, you're going to want to grease up while you're doing this job. Got a brake pads or caliper spreader or pad spreader, however you want to say it. But basically this is going to force the piston in the brake caliper to go back in to allow us to use these brand new pads that are going to be thicker than the old pads they're replacing. And you'll understand that later. And this is just a digital caliper. This is going to be used to measure the thickness of the brake rotors, and I'll show you why it is that I'm not replacing the rotors at the same time that I'm replacing the pads. Before we work on the brake system, we need to pop the hood and remove this panel to access the brake fluid reservoir on top of the brake booster. And you can take off this lid if you want. I'm not going to do that because I don't want to have any contaminants enter the system, but that might relieve a little bit of the pressure. But we basically want to make sure that we're not going to overflow this cylinder as we're pushing the pistons back in. When we push the pistons back in to the caliper, it's going to force brake fluid back through the system and up into this reservoir, and we just want to make sure that it doesn't overflow. The first thing that we need to do before replacing these pads is jack the car up and then remove the front wheels. Okay, I'm using a adapter for a jack pad or whatever. It's made by Burger Tuning. But basically you want something that's going to go in here and match up with the jack point in this little hole. And a lot of times your floor jack or something, whatever you're using to jack it up, whether it's a scissor jack or a floor jack, is not going to be able to fit in this hole underneath here very well. So this adapter will put the upward pressure in a specific point on the frame rail in order to not damage the car. So let's get this jacked up. Before you actually get the wheels off of the ground, you should break the lug nuts free. Otherwise you'll just have your front wheels spinning and you won't be able to get the wheel off. Now that we have the lug nuts broken free, we can go ahead and finish jacking the car up. And we want to put some jack stands under the frame rail just in case. This isn't maybe the ideal way to do this, but you want to have something there just in case anything happens, that you won't be killed if you're under the car. You might mess up some of the plastic under here, but you won't hurt yourself. Now go ahead and remove the wheel and set that out of the way. Before we go any further with replacing the pads, I promised that I would show you why it is that I'm not replacing the rotors at the same time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my measuring caliper here. I've got it set on millimeters. So replacement rotors come with a 30 millimeter thickness, and that's the thickness here of the overall rotor. The minimum that you want them to be is 28. That's the minimum allowable thickness for the rotor before it needs to be replaced. Okay, so it's a little bit hard to do while I'm holding the camera here, but I've got it tightened down here on the edge of the rotor, and as you can see, it is 28.5. Not sure if you could see that very well, but it's over the minimum. So the thinnest area of the rotor that I was able to measure was 28.5 millimeters. Or I'm sorry, yeah, 28.5 millimeters. And so obviously that doesn't leave me a whole lot of room for wear. I chose deliberately to do this for funds, for financial reasons at this point. You probably might make a different decision and go ahead and replace the rotors at the same time. Next, we need to remove this spring here from inside the caliper. I'm going to do this by using a little bit of leverage with a flathead screwdriver and pull it out. You're going to want to use two hands, so I'm not going to be able to show you while I'm holding the camera, but go ahead and remove this spring before we go any further. Here's what it looks like. It was in kind of like this. It just kind of pops this direction and then out. So we want to go ahead and remove that. The next thing we need to do is pop off these little caps here. And there's one on the top here and there's one on the bottom of the caliper. We're looking at the back side of the caliper here. And this is what the caps look like when you pop them off. Now we need a 7 millimeter hex wrench or socket if you have one. And we just basically put it into that hole that we exposed by popping off the cap. And we want to loosen but not completely remove the nuts that are in there. Alright, there you can see the top of the bolt that we've been loosening, on the top anyways. And the point is this piece of the caliper is going to come off. This part inside here, this metal piece, is not. So we just need to get enough clearance so that this outside piece can slip over this inside piece and come off. And you might have to end up pushing the brake piston in a little bit in order to make this happen. But once you get the bolt backed out a ways, and then you can kind of push the piston back in a little bit. Just basically what I did was just kind of using my hands and maybe a foot for leverage, just kind of pull this piece this way, and eventually you'll get it. Now that we have this to where it will come off, we need to give it something to rest on, because we're attached by these brake lines here and we can't just let it dangle. So I'm going to take this off and just rest it on an old box or whatever you have handy, so that we don't break the brake lines as we work on this. Okay, so we have the caliper sitting on this box, and we can see the two brake pads that we're going to be replacing. In order to get the piston to go back in as far as it'll go, we're going to use our brake spreader. So basically we're going to take out this pad here. I'm going to have a hard time doing it one-handed. But then we're going to put this in here and basically tighten this screw here, which is going to push the piston back into the caliper and allow us room, because the new pads are going to be substantially thicker, and then we're going to have a hard time getting it back over the rotors if we don't push the piston back in. So now you can see that the piston is pushed back into its home. We might be able to get it a tiny bit more, but I ran out of room on my spreader. I think this is going to be good enough, so we will go ahead and put the new pads in. Before installing these pads, we need to get our disc brake quiet and put some on the back of the pads where it's going to come in contact with the caliper and the piston, so that we minimize any chatter and noise that we create. So now you can see what it's going to look like, and if you're worried about the color, don't worry about this. It's going to be black with brake dust soon enough, so really no one's ever going to see the bright orange color. Okay, now we've got the pads in the calipers, and we're going to slide the caliper back on here and then tighten up those back bolts. Go ahead and put the caps back on the back, and then we're going to pop this spring back in to hold the caliper in place on the front. And that completes the passenger side front. So the driver's side front is going to be the exact same thing except for one step, and that's going to be our brake sensor. So when we get to that point on that side, I will show you how to do that one. This right here is the brake pad sensor on the driver's side front. And once we take this apart, you'll be able to see how it sits on the brake pad itself, and how we're going to take it off and how we're going to put it back on. So here's our new front pad that clips inside the piston, and there's a little retaining clip that you'll need to use that goes inside here, and then this new sensor essentially clips on. It's gonna have a hard time doing this. Clips in like this when we're ready to install it. Okay, here's the new wire connected, the new sensor, and it just kind of clips in that little groove there. And then as this piece wears down along with the pads, it will get to a certain point, and then it will trip the sensor. We're going to want to remove the old sensor wire from the back. It kind of clips into a couple of these, snakes back around up through here, and then goes into this little box. And that's where the connector is. We need to pull this one out and then put the new one in once we get the caliper mounted. So the sensor pops out the back of the caliper here, goes through this little clip, another clip, and I'll get it in this clip in a second, but pops in this little box here, and then you push back down the lid, snap it back on. Just try to keep brake dust out and road debris and stuff. and then you're ready to put everything back on. Put the caps on and the spring, put the wheel back on, and go from there.